atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good afternoon, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing on this Friday afternoon?
Well, the one line I was going to go with was feeling like garbage, Mike. But that's not actually true. Things are actually going pretty well, in a good mood here, so I won't say that.
Gotcha. See, I was wondering if you were going to go with that or if you were going to say that, well, I am at my home with all of my guns loaded, just waiting for them to come after me now, a la J.D. Vance. But I knew it was one or the other, so you did not disappoint. Thank you so much for that. Also, before we get going, I want to thank, let's see, well, that's a nice segue. Wow. JRAF, who is a Patreon trial member. Thank you, JRA, if that's what you go by, or maybe your friends just call you F. I don't know. But either way, we do appreciate you giving us a chance on Patreon. We hope you become a full member. So thank you so very much. Now, before we get started with our final pre-election episode, Jay, there was something, I always listen to the episodes you do with Justin, and there was something that came up that I wanted to ask you about. Now, obviously, you're not a fan of Donald Trump's proposed tariffs. We've talked about that before. I know you're not a fan of his stance, his kind of lukewarm stance on Ukraine either.
Yes.
And last week, when you and Justin were discussing tariffs, you suggested that Trump wasn't serious about them, and you came out with he should be taken seriously but not literally, and that there would be a lobbying bonanza against tariffs. And two things occurred.
I think so.
Yeah. Two things occurred to me there. The first is it only Trump that should be taken seriously but not literally, or should we apply that same, what I would call very forgiving standard to Kamala Harris as well? What do you think?
So I would think that it's almost, I would say, I don't think the best way to put this. My sense with, and I read this somewhere, someone else voiced it better than I did, that the hope with Donald Trump is he's not going to do what he promises to do. The fear with Kamala Harris is that she's going to do a whole lot of things that she's promising not to do. So I think that's sort of where I come from, right? I think Trump makes this big statement about tariffs. He's going to do all this stuff. Much as he said, he's going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. And those statements are serious in terms of, here is my policy direction, right? Are they literal in that it's actually going to happen? Very much, I doubt it. Again, to the extent tariffs would require some congressional action. Now, there's some things he can do on his own, right? That
was my second question, but I wanted to get to that. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that you don't think that Kamala Harris should be taken seriously or literally.
Correct.
Okay. Right. All right.
I mean, I shouldn't say seriously. I think you could be seriously worried about her.
But that's different from taking her seriously. You see what I'm saying? Okay.
Certainly not.
Okay. So on that second thing, that's the second thing I wondered about, because I don't think lobbying would matter. The president has all sorts of statutory authority. I looked it up in this last week. You got the Trade Expansion Act in 1962, the Trade Act in 1974, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, and there's more. And so it seems to me that if Donald Trump wants to essentially on his own raise tariffs, he essentially has all sorts of congressional authority pre-existing to do that. And so I don't think any of this lobbying that you think is going to happen would really matter that much at all.
Oh, I think it does for a couple reasons. One, people can certainly still lobby. You can say, well, the president has that authority. That doesn't mean he's got that authority now and in perpetuity. So folks can certainly lobby Congress to say, hey, Mr. President, we're really concerned about this. And members of Congress, in fact, whole coalitions of Congress could make it clear to the president that, listen, if you want the rest of this agenda, you want this and that, you're going to have to maybe take it a little easy on the tariffs. The other piece is there is executive lobbying that goes on. how effective that would be in a Trump administration, in a Trump 2 administration, right, where you don't have sort of the usual players. I think there's a good question there about whether it's as effective as it might typically be. But you would have, I think, many of your big business companies that do business internationally pushing on the administration, saying, listen, this is not what you want to do, or this is not the way you want to do it. And Trump does seem to listen to those sort of voices. And I think he might say, yeah, I'm, changed my mind. It's not going to be an across the board 10% tariff. Tariff is perhaps not the most beautiful word in the English language, next to love and faith or whatever it was that he said. So no, I think there still could be a lobbying effort regardless. And yeah, because keep in mind, one, Congress holds the authority to revoke the president's authority or put limits on it as things move forward. Now, I don't think that would actually happen in real life, right? I don't think there would be a let's restrain Trump on tariffs bill, but there would be some grousing and some, hey, if you want this, don't do that I think would make a big deal.
So then let me try to apply this in another area. So if what you're saying, and I think it matters what you're saying, because I think a lot of folks also who are sort of more traditional Republicans feel the same way. So I know you often come back with, well, I'm just this one guy, but I think you represent sort of a segment of the Republican Party.
Millions, Mike.
That's sort of a rump segment,
dozens,
but still matters.
People across this country.
But if I'm to take that, what you're saying seriously and literally maybe, that you think it's important to believe in what Trump is saying directionally, but not necessarily in terms of extent or amount. Okay. Yeah. Then I wonder how that applies to the more than 100 times now on the campaign trail. He said that he is going to seek retribution against his enemies, including prosecutors who brought cases against him, judges who ruled against him, that sort of thing, even grand jurors in one or two cases. How do you understand that directionally then? Because I struggle.
Well, I think those are things that he would simply not be able to do, right? You can't. It depends on what you mean by retribution. Again, certainly, as we said, he can't send the National Guard or the Army out to arrest Adam Schiff. He certainly can't mess with grand jurors, and that goes sort of in keeping with my view that no matter Trump gets elected, he's going to be very much restrained by all of the institutions on the planet as he was before, right? There's going to be sort of the massive resistance.
Well, let me stop you there.
I think he makes these big statements, but those are things that maybe he might want to do privately, but I don't see him having the ability to follow through on it. Also, let's take a look back at Trump 1, right? I mean, he vowed sort of revenge and all these things against all sorts of folks, but it never really came to fruition.
But let's keep in mind, and this is something that even the Wall Street Journal, which I know you respect and read on a regular basis, said, is that there's not going to be a Jeff Sessions who's going to recuse himself from certain things in the Trump administration. There's not going to be a Mike Pence who's going to stand up about the whatever it is. And so all of those figures have basically been weeded out. And even the Journal said, well, we're just going to basically have to hope that his attention span is too short and he's too lazy, essentially, or too unfocused to actually do all these things. And that seems to me to be a pretty thin thing to cling on to.
You're not going to bet on Trump being unfocused and lazy?
No, but no, I'm saying that if what we're saying,
risk liberty on it. No, I think I agree with the point that you're making, and I sort of alluded to it a little bit a minute ago when we talked about the lobbying, executive lobbying, and who he listens to, that without sort of the typical folks he might surround himself with, it's going to be a little bit different. But that said, you still have to get through court systems. Prosecutors have to have oaths that they have to take. They are subject to discipline by courts and bar associations and things like that.
Right.
I don't see. Again, I don't think that he would have the power And when I say power, let me back up. I'm not saying authority. I'm saying the ability to follow through with those threats. And I'm not even sure like what those threats.
Well, let me
are,
give you an
right?
example.
I mean,
Okay, let me give you an example.
What is it that he's gonna,
like for instance, when he first became president, he appointed Jeff Sessions Attorney General.
Yeah.
And Jeff Sessions, I disagree with on a lot, but Jeff Sessions, I believe, had a code, had his own certain sense of honor, which is why he recused himself from that initial investigation and upset Donald Trump to no end. Then he had Bill Barr, and Bill Barr, who certainly a big executive power guy, but also a guy who pretty clearly had some lines in the end that he was uncomfortable and unwilling to cross. It seems vanishingly unlikely to me that when Donald Trump names his next attorney general, if he wins on Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever it comes out, that he's going to pick anyone like that. And given his experiences, his bad experiences with his previous attorneys general, yeah, he's going to pick somebody and get that person confirmed through a Republican-controlled Senate who's going to be far more compliant. And so even though Donald Trump might not get convictions, he certainly is going to take whatever, I think the term that's used, that he uses is lawfare. And what we've seen supposedly from Democrats is going to look like nothing compared to what a Donald Trump Department of Justice could potentially unleash, regardless of whether there are any convictions in the end.
Well, no, I very much agree that the lawfare is a concern, especially when there aren't convictions, right? Because that sort of almost makes it worse in that this is the Justice Department being engaged simply to harass somebody when there isn't a real crime to be prosecuted. I mean, I'm not sure what I can say in terms of to say, well, look, no, I have proof that he won't appoint someone like that. What I'm relying on is the institutional inertia, right?
Gotcha.
Of the Justice Department, of the court system.
Gotcha.
That you're going to have a lot of people, let's say Justice Department employees, who would simply say, no, I'm not going to do that.
Well, that's where the Schedule F changes come in.
You'll have something, so for example, I mean, looking back on the Watergate era, right? You know, there was the midnight firings and sort of there were numerous times where you had a lot of folks, he went through how many folks when he was trying to fire prosecutors back then. And it was finally Robert Bork who did it. But what I'm saying is, I think you would have a lot of folks who understand that they're going to have a life and a career after Donald Trump is gone in 4 years, and they're not going to risk all of that or the potential claims of, they could be prosecuted themselves before too long. So that's what I'm saying is there is that institutional inertia out there.
And that's why the creation of the Schedule F that actually Donald Trump did with an executive order in the waning days of his initial term, and he would almost certainly reinstate as one of the first things he did in his next term, is such a critical part of that, because if you put a lot more employees, and they said that 50,000 federal workers, that would be more of a floor than a ceiling of folks who would at that point then serve, at the pleasure of the president. That's why that's such an important part of that, to make sure that you are able to put more loyalists into that position. But it sounds like what it all boils down to in the end is that...
Well, loyalists, yes and no. I mean, there's loyalists and there's loyalists. And keep in mind, Trump will come into office as a lame duck. I'd say more than a lame duck. Again, given the institutional resistance that's going to confront him.
Got it.
I guess I understand. Listen this way: if anyone wants to interview prior Trump attorneys about Trump loyalty, well, you can talk to Rudy Giuliani and ask him how that's gone for him.
Sure. I guess in the end, you just have a lot more faith in the ability of what I see as weakened institutions, weakened Republican elected officials who are far more, in my view, Trump aligned than certainly they were in 2016 to check the president. You believe that's going to happen? I would guess that you.
I think there are checks built into the systems themselves, right?
Sure.
I mean, consider he's been not terribly successful, even when he was president, in getting through a lot of executive orders, even by judges who he appointed. Likewise, the Supreme Court rejected his stolen election theories at every turn, as did plenty of judges who had been appointed by Republicans or appointed by him. So I think those institutions are stronger than you would give them credit for. Besides which, all of this will be zealously reported by the press, which is something you would not necessarily see in a Democratic administration.
Sure. Well, I disagree with that. Clearly, democracy no longer dies in darkness if you're Jeff Bezos, but we'll get to that. Anyway, it's a nice little newspaper he has. It'd be a shame if something happened to it in the Trump administration, but more on that in a little bit here. So I maybe you will, maybe you won't, I don't know, but maybe you'll concede that there is likely to be less resistance than there was in 2016.
No, I think there'd be more.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
I think you are. I think you are disastrously wrong about that. I hope we do not find out, and I hope if we do, you are right, and I am entirely wrong. But I fear that you are once again living in a political world that died a generation or two ago, and let's hope you're right and I'm wrong about that. So we'll see.
Well, anyway. Let's go back to, again, Trump won and Biden, and who talked about locking up opponents and who's actually been working on it, right? Who's actually locked people up? It wasn't Trump.
Well,
we can say, well, those folks had it coming to them, but for example, Steve Bannon was in contempt of Congress. I mean, anyone who is in contempt of Congress always goes to jail. But yeah, I mean, to me, I just don't. I'm saying, if you want to compare the Trump record on prosecuting political opponents versus the Biden record, yeah, Trump comes out looking like the ACLU. I think
that would be another conversation. I would argue that the level of corruption and criminality in Trump and
had it coming. Yeah,
well, not had it coming. That's kind of a negative connotation, but that's the job of, I would argue, law enforcement and the legal system is to prosecute people who they believe have violated the law and not to just seek retribution against political enemies. Now, sometimes those
Which makes it so weird that if you have one guy who refuses to testify before Congress and actually goes out, stands on the steps of Congress, makes a big photo op showing about how he's not going to testify before Congress, he doesn't get prosecuted, but you have another guy who gets hauled off a plane in leg irons and put in jail.
Right. And so just for listeners who don't know, who the two guys you're talking about?
The one would be Hunter Biden, and the other would be Peter Navarro.
Okay, there you go. I just wanted to make sure, because I know a lot of folks wouldn't have necessarily gotten that, because that sort of, I would say that
it's
sort
the
of
exact same crime, and the crime is not showing up to testify before Congress.
Right.
And I would argue that, look, Navarro had a really dumb, weak executive privilege argument, which he should lose, but at least it was a colorful argument. Hunter's argument was, I don't want to. That's so much why Republicans, when you hear stuff like that, if we're afraid Trump's going to prosecute people, they say, well, as compared to what? And when they say there's a two-tier justice system, if you look at the two FBI lovebirds who were texting about using the 25th Amendment to take out Trump. Mm-hmm. And the names escape me.
I believe it was like Strzok, sort of, Peter. I want to say like Strzok or Strzok. I know, but I know the two people you're talking about.
And his girlfriend. Like they've walked away from this multimillionaires. The FBI settled. They sued the FBI, and the FBI happily settled with them for millions of dollars. And again, to me, that's just mind-boggling. And again, this is something that most Republicans look and say, yes, that's the two-tier justice system.
Just to be clear, if I understand your argument, is that the justice system has been, under Merrick Garland and the Biden administration, has been essentially unfair and politically corrupt, and the Trump justice system will be less unfair and less corrupt. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. That's
yes.
okay.
I'm willing to. No, I'm willing.
Okay.
To, I'm willing to go there. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that is just colossally, disastrously wrong, but I understand where you're coming from, and I just wanted to be clear on that. Okay, great.
All right.
All right. So, at this point, it's, again, we're recording this Friday afternoon. Election day is Tuesday. So it's pretty much all over except for the voting, at least for people like you, Jay, who haven't voted. I have already. But, in this last week, there was a lot of focus on closing events and closing messages. You had Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden rally, his 3-hour conversation with Joe Rogan, Kamala Harris deciding not to go on Rogan's podcast because she didn't want to, I guess, fly down to Austin, Texas for 3 hours or half a day or something like that. And I want to start with the Trump rally because, Jay, he obviously isn't going to win New York. And some of the things that happened at that rally, I mean, I think a lot of people felt they were offensive. I'd be willing to bet that if some of Trump's handlers, I guess he must have handlers, I don't know, they give him a whip and a chair or something, I don't know, but would have said that Tony Hinchcliffe, whatever, that guy, let's not book him, right?
Yeah.
The whole.
Did you know, Mike? He is from Youngstown, Ohio.
I did not. So
all roads lead back to Y-Town.
So, I mean, he was doing with the floating island, the garbage for Puerto Rico thing.
Yeah.
Right. And then there was, to me, even because you can have some nutty comics say stupid stuff. Okay, he should have been vetted better. Even if you want to give that a charitable kind of reading, which let's just do that for the sake of argument. But you have Stephen Miller, Trump's sort of one of his top domestic policy advisors in his last term, going to be a top guy this time, almost certainly, saying, America is for America and Americans only. That to me was in a way more chilling and scarier than some comedian making an awful joke about Puerto Ricans or Jews or, Palestinians. But
yeah, I'd agree with you. Yeah.
Okay. It's just kind of shivered down my spine. And, of course, Trump doubled down on the enemy from within comments. And he said to Rogan that essentially anti-Trump people are more of a threat to the country than anything China or Russia might be attempting to do. And to me, from this and so many other things, as Trump's kind of wrapped up his message, it seems to me that the Trump strategy is not to reach out to anyone. You're either MAGA or you're the enemy within. And to Trump and his supporters, there really is no such thing as principled opposition. You cannot oppose Donald Trump on anything without being dumb, a low IQ, a nasty person who should be somehow pushed aside. I don't know. That's my take on Trump's.
One might even call those people deplorable.
Yeah, one might even. So I don't know. What do you think about Trump's?
No, I think that's probably, I guess, yeah, but go ahead.
No, I was saying before, I know you wanted to pivot to Harris and things that Democrats have said about Republicans, but let's not get into whataboutism for now. Let's just talk about Donald Trump's message and look at it on its own terms. And then we can move to the other side.
Okay.
So what do you make of that closing message? If you agree with me that that's sort of the message, and maybe you don't.
So I think the message is, I think it's a strong get out the vote message. It's they're gonna, they're coming for you if you don't, right? It's intending to inspire fear to get people out to vote. It's raising the stakes, saying, I think one of the things he said, which he usually says, is, the most important election in American history. But I think there are a whole lot of candidates who have said that a whole lot of times, and you'll find people saying that on both sides. So I'm not sure why there's always this sort of weird thing of when we come on the show, here's Donald Trump said something crazy offensive, and Jay, what do you think? And I say, yeah, I think that's crazy and offensive, but I'm not. Yeah,
sure. Also,
I'm not sure what you're looking.
I just want to get your take, because I know my take on these things, but I understand I'm coming at this from a certain perspective, and so when I was asking is, what do you think about it? I guess strategically, and not
strategically. I think it's a good tool to rally your base to get them out to vote. Yeah. And again, that's so often there's this thing, and we get this in the comments and in the the listener questions that always tend to seem to be directed to me, and maybe that tells the story in and of itself. But sort of trying to get my moral opinion on something that Donald Trump has done. That Trump did this or said this. Isn't this terrible? And I always sort of look at this as, well, yeah, it could be, but my condemnation, my moral condemnation, doesn't add anything.
It doesn't individually, but I think it represents what I feel to be a sort of evolved, I guess I'll call it evolved, worldview of Republicans from the 1990s. So back in the 90s, Republicans were all about, and I was one of them, was all about character matters. And now it's, character matters, but not as much as tax cuts and deregulation.
No, here's the thing is, I look at what we do here in large part as kind of like sportscasters, right? Kind of giving the color commentary and giving the game background and the strategy and here's the plays I think you should run, and here's why I think this play works and this one doesn't. Not getting into the morality of the players so much. To some extent, I understand that's in politics. That's always part of it, right? Because character matters.
Does it?
And I would make an argument more than most that character matters.
Really?
But yeah.
Okay.
But in terms of if you're asking, is it an effective message to rally his base and get out the vote? Yeah. And I guess then, it's not whataboutism to say that isn't that the same message that Kamala Harris is putting out about he's going to be a dictator and all your freedoms and this is the most, this is the same sort of thing. And
what I meant is that I just wanted to, without immediately jumping to, well, the other side is doing it. I just wanted to, I want to, because I said both campaigns have made their closing arguments. And certainly in Harris's speech in D.C. with, by the way, a huge crowd, Donald Trump wishes he had crowds of over 75,000 at this point, that she said she'll come into the Oval Office with a to-do list. Donald Trump will come in with an enemies list. Now, I think, since given the fact that Donald Trump has said
that's a good line.
It is, and it tracks with reality.
But I think voters can rightly say that. Can we see your to-do list?
Well, I mean, I think she's already brought out her to-do list. So, in terms of a whole bunch of policy positions she's laid out now. This idea that people don't know enough about Harris and her policy positions, I mean, I think that's just ridiculous. It doesn't take much to find out what she said she's going to do. But I mean, by your logic, it doesn't matter because we shouldn't take her seriously or literally.
Joe Biden, and that's not a winning electoral message.
But I guess what I'm saying is that essentially it would not matter what she said. You just said a few minutes ago, given the fact that she cannot be taken seriously nor literally by you, a centrist right Republican.
To a large extent, yeah.
So she could have said anything. Nothing she could have said, it seems to me, would have mattered to you if you come into it with a viewpoint of she shouldn't be taken seriously or literally. So then that leaves her nothing.
Well, I guess
maybe not. I don't know.
I arrive at that based on, she's made numerous contradictory statements about what she's for and what she's against. And she's going to turn the page and what would you do different from Biden? Well, nothing. That sort of thing. So no, that's why I don't take her seriously or literally. I take seriously, again, I look at the not what people say, but what they do, politicians say, but what they do. And I think if you look at what she's done, it would be the same sort of, Joe Biden policies. And people don't really want that. People don't like Donald Trump as a person. I don't like Donald Trump as a person. Right. But I think they look at the two policy menus and they see a difference.
Well, I don't know that
I'm also not concerned that Donald Trump is going to try to radically alter, the Supreme Court and, in favor of getting rid of the filibuster and all those sorts of.
I mean, that's what we do as partisans. If we have a candidate who we do not particularly like, we do our best to sort of find motivated reasoning ways to convince ourselves that the things we don't like in that person will be minimized and the things we do like will be maximized, which I think is the value of having two partisans talk to each other in the way that you and I do, because you clearly have some biases coming into this, and I certainly do as well.
Yeah.
And I think we're both, willing to admit that, But going back to the strategy thing, I mean, I didn't realize this. Pennsylvania, in terms of percentage of state population, Pennsylvania has the sixth largest Puerto Rican population of any state in the country. And
who knew?
Georgia and Wisconsin are up there pretty high up as well. And so just strategically, having that guy make that remark, certainly not a great thing.
It was, batshit crazy stupid. I mean, and to me, it's unfathomable that as someone didn't say, can we see your script first? Can you tell us, what kind of bit you're going to do here? Because typically campaign events are tightly run down to the minute and who's standing where and how the lighting is and all those things, right? So to have this guy strikes me as, again, kind of political malpractice. Unless you want to subscribe to the Trump is really an evil genius thinking 10 moves ahead, and I don't think he is, right? That he'll say something really crazy and inflammatory like the garbage thing, and Biden will take the bait, or someone will take the bait, and then Trump will turn. Now, again, I think that's giving Trump a whole lot more credit. I think it's much more likely hey, Donald, here's this comedian. He's pretty funny. And, oh, man, he really loves you. He thinks you're the best. And Trump says, well, sign him up, as opposed to, let me take a look at this. I think that's the much more likely answer.
Or they actually did look at it and decide. I mean, that's the other option, right? Is that they did actually pre-vet his comments and decided that would be okay, which that seems bizarre to me, just from a strategic standpoint.
Again, sort of political malpractice. And I think the only reason you could come up with for that would be some sort of three-dimensional chess thing of, well, if he goes out and says this kind of stuff, I'm sure the other guys are going to blow it up, and then we'll hit back, that kind of thing. But to me, that seems much more use kind of the Occam's razor theory. I think it's more likely they just didn't bother to vet him.
And, a lot of Democrats, including myself, are feeling less and less optimistic because as we've gotten closer to election day, certainly a lot of things seem to be breaking Donald Trump's way. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And one possible explanation that I've seen floated that I think actually has a lot going for it is that Democrats who weren't big fans of Joe Biden, and that's most of them, right? Remember the polls, right? 70+% or something like that. They came home to Harris pretty quickly after Biden was pushed out. So she gets that big bump immediately, but it's taken longer for Republicans who, like you, have real problems with Donald Trump to sort of come home to Trump over Harris. But eventually, almost all partisans kind of do. And when you take a look at trends in partisan identification, things look pretty good for Republicans. And so this isn't necessarily all that surprising because I cannot imagine what it would take for someone like you to vote for a Democrat over a Republican at the presidential level. That would the series of events that would have to transpire would be.
You don't
right?
always know how I vote.
No, but I'm saying just generally speaking. I'm not talking about specifics. Yeah. My point is that party identification is an awful strong tie, and your person has to be just horrifically, dreadfully awful, and the other person would have to be.
It's pretty bad.
Bizarrely, yeah. But as bad as Donald Trump is, I cannot envision a Democrat who would be so good by the lights of Republicans like you that any significant number of them would vote for that person. That there are some folks clearly.
I would have voted for Joe Lieberman.
Okay.
Again, and let's say if it's a Lieberman-Trump contest, right? If it's Lieberman-Bush or something like that, no, I think I still vote Republican. I think I could vote for the senator from West Virginia,
Joe Manchin.
Yeah, I think there was talk of a third party run there. I could have seen him as a, if it's between him and Trump. Yeah, I think I would do that. So I wouldn't say no one ever. I'd say it's certainly the exception to the
Sure,
rule.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's my larger point, is that because of that, I mean, that partisan identification being such a very strong sort of pull, especially for someone who's been so strongly identified with the party, and you're like that, but there are millions of other Republicans like you who are in similar kind of positions. So again, this isn't me trying to call you out, Jay. It's those millions that you represent. Okay,
the millions I represent. I don't really think I represent millions. It's flattering that you or other folks think that. But,
I don't know. I think you do, because I think you represent what I would call the Wall Street Journal Republicans. Like, for instance, I read we'll talk about this in just a minute, newspaper endorsements and non-endorsements, not that they matter, but the Wall Street Journal, the last president they actually formally endorsed, do you know this? You might not.
I would say George W. Bush.
Nope. Got to go back a little bit further. Herbert Hoover.
That
didn't work out too well for them.
That wasn't their best pick, probably.
No. But if you
that kind of soured them on it.
Yeah, exactly. They learned their lesson. But if you are a regular reader of the Wall Street Journal, and I am pretty much every day, along with the Times and the Post. No, I haven't canceled my subscription, but that they didn't do an endorsement, but they ran two columns that from their editorial board, kind of outlining what they saw as their view of the Trump.
Yes.
And it was
the view of the Trump and
and it was all but a Trump endorsement. I mean, they didn't say we endorse Donald Trump, but there's no way you could read those two columns and not sort of get that understanding. And like I said, because I read the Journal a lot, it feels to me that you are so very well aligned with that worldview. And that's why I say that you, I believe, can represent a view that's not just your own, but that seems to me very congruent with what probably, like I said, millions of Americans.
Well, I
really
appreciate
feel.
that. And there are times, and we've noted them, when I say something on our Saturday show, and
it'll be an editorial.
Monday morning, the Journal runs the op-ed.
There you go.
From my lips to their ears. But no, I would say, if you're looking at where I line up politically, that would tend to be, I would tend to agree with the Wall Street Journal editorial board probably 8-9 times out of 10.
Yep.
Yeah. At
Absolutely.
least.
Yep. And so I guess the last thing I'll say before we move on to this, our next topic, which is the non-endorsements.
Where they agree with me.
Yeah, there you go. Let's go with that. So it is that the one thing that still gives me at least somewhat hope is that it seems clear to me that the Harris campaign still has a stronger grassroots get out the vote operation, door knocking operation. I know Musk and his America PAC have put a lot of money into that, but I've seen a number of reports saying that it hasn't been necessarily that effective. And so, of course, not only that, but there was a Gallup just released data a couple days ago, I believe, finding that Democrats have a 10-point enthusiasm for voting advantage over Republicans, which is it's nice to see if your folks are more enthusiastic about voting. And my hope is that those two things together can overcome what looks to me like if we just took and I know Trey's big on it's inside the margin area, you can't tell, but you see the trend lines, you see what so many polls are saying. If we looked at just kind of that polling data, Trump wins on that where we're at right now, which is why I think a number of the models suggest that. But I think that those Harris advantages might be just enough to let her eke out a victory. So I'm sticking with my original projections of, I think, Harris with 270 something electoral votes, but in my gut, I don't know if I'm feeling that. But anyway, do you have any last minute changes or thoughts?
No, I think I'll stick wherever I was last week, and I don't really remember exactly where it was. Although I do want to put an asterisk on something that Justin and I talked about in terms of polling and things of actual numbers that I looked at that I think are different than before. And the one was Republican registration that has been boosted, has been higher than usual throughout the country. What I don't know, and maybe you do, and maybe you don't, is from when to when was that Republican boost? Because I could see some of that being kind of a fake Republican registration boost, in that Democrats who had no real primary to vote in in states where that have semi-open primaries, register as Republicans in order to vote against Trump. So that you might have some of those showing up in the new registrants list that are really Democrats and are going to vote Democrat anyway.
Yeah, my sense is that
I think that was just something that occurred to me, that there's that number, but I'm not sure if that number is telling us everything that we think it is. Maybe it is, but
I think it largely is, because my sense is that kind of registering of the other party it's not non-existent.
It doesn't happen often.
Exactly. So I don't think it happens in numbers that would really significantly alter that. So yeah.
But my thought would be in this kind of election, it might. Right. Rio had an incumbent, and essentially the primary was done before it started on the Democratic side. And you have someone who is as reviled as Donald Trump, that maybe you would have more of that cross registration to vote against him. But yeah, I don't know. And it could be that it doesn't really matter, because maybe most of this registration growth is post primary. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I don't know that. And of course, there's no way we would know if those new registrations are, whenever they happen, are genuine, folks who decide to register for the other party, right, for Republicans, or if they're people who are doing it for some sort of strategic, if maybe not three-dimensional chess, but I don't know, three-dimensional checkers kind of reason or something like that.
Yeah.
So I don't think that matters a whole lot, but I know one thing that matters even less, and that's newspaper endorsements. Now, I think you can make an argument that newspaper endorsements might matter in some local races, right? Because they're less partisan. Voters might not have a lot of information about the candidates in some instances.
Yeah, down ballot stuff, I think it makes a much bigger difference.
Exactly. But at the presidential level, come on, I think everyone knows that, right? And of the four national papers that we have, only one, the Wall Street Journal, hasn't regularly endorsed the candidate. But as I mentioned, they kind of do, but they just don't come out and say that, basically, right? But USA Today, they stayed out of the endorsement game until 2016. They didn't endorse Clinton that year, but they urged people to not vote for Trump. They said he was unfit for office. Then in 2020, they endorsed Biden. They said character, competence, and credibility are on the ballot. And this was written, before January 6th. And so I assume they would be even more on the ballot in 2024. But this year, USA Today and its more than 200 local affiliates decided not to either endorse Harris or even to suggest to voters that Trump remains unfit for office. So there's that. Then there is, of course, the Washington Post, which kind of got most of the attention, I think rightly so. They started endorsing presidential candidates in 1976. They've consistently endorsed Democrats, and they were all set to endorse Kamala Harris. And then Jeff Bezos said, no, we're not going to be endorsing anyone. And he followed that up after a lot of uproar with a piece he had published in his paper, writing that newspaper endorsements do nothing to tip the scales of an election on the presidential level. Absolutely so. He said they do create a perception of bias, whether deserved or not. And he made this analogy to voting machines, saying that not only do they have to count votes accurately, but people have to believe they're counting votes accurately. And so I certainly agree with that logic, but I think Jeff Bezos' argument is just ridiculous on the face of it, because if he is saying that he instructed his newspaper to not endorse Donald Trump to make it appear to voters or to Americans that the Washington Post is not a biased left-wing newspaper, well, then he clearly does not read the Washington Post. Apparently, he must not have signed off. I guess
that was going to be my. Well, you're sort of stealing my thunder a little bit.
Well, exactly. But I mean,
yes. Thank goodness now no one will think that the Washington Post is left wing or biased.
Well, that's why this is a bogus argument, because he was perfectly fine with the whole democracy dies in darkness thing that happened a month after Trump was inaugurated. Everyone knows what that was all about. If you read through the Post editorial board columns, it reads like they could be written by the DNC, practically all of them. And so this feels to me, right when I heard about this on the heels of the LA Times also not endorsing because their billionaire owner instructed their editorial board to quash their Harris endorsement. Struck me, I recall the argument you make a number of times about the regulatory state. That whole, I alluded to it earlier. Yeah. Nice newspaper, be ashamed if something happened to it. And of course, Jeff Bezos does have a number of federal government interests. Just so happens that his space company, Blue Origin, they have like $3-4 billion in contracts. They are, have $5-6 billion more that they're bidding for. And it seems to me that that's an argument that would fit the one that you regularly make, would explain a lot about why some of these billionaires they actually are taking Trump both seriously and literally about the whole enemies list thing. I wanted to get your take on that.
So I'm thinking, one, I don't know, is Jeff Bezos really concerned about $5 billion? I don't know. If that were the case, wouldn't this have happened sooner? Again, Bezos has owned the New York Times or the Washington Post for what, 10 years or so?
Since 2015, I believe it was.
Yeah, so about 10 years. And again, has been a staunch anti-Trump voice, I think, both through the paper, to the extent that you want to say he speaks personally through the paper, and also just in his own words and where he spends money and so forth. So I don't know that there's this idea that Bezos is going to say, well, we think we should pull our punches now because we might lose SpaceX contracts. Yeah, I just don't. I'm not saying it's impossible, but
so you don't think? Let me. I think
it's more. It is more of a sort of fig leaf saying, look, we're not a real strictly partisan operation because look here, we're not endorsing.
But that doesn't pass the smell test. Even though, as you point out, they really sort of have been, just like the Wall Street Journal has been, for the last several years. But I guess what I'm struggling with here, and I'm not trying to be cute about this or anything, is that it seems to me that the logic, if you're Jeff Bezos, sure, you're the second richest man in the world, maybe it doesn't, $5 billion isn't a ton, but it's still not nothing to you. And so maybe you think, well, why should I take the trouble? Why don't I just stay out of this? And it's better for the shareholders. It's better for me. And it seems to me the same sort of logic that would apply to if you are a business that is potentially being regulated by a regulator and you say, well, this won't drive us under, but we'd rather have 4 or 5 billion more than not have it. So why do we just not get in the way of the angry man who is all of a sudden threatening retribution against everyone?
Well, because one, you decided to buy a newspaper, so I think the sort of the argument that, well, look, gosh, I didn't think any politics would be involved if I owned the Washington Post. I don't think that flies, right? That it's like all of a sudden he's gosh, I don't want to get mixed up in this political stuff. Setting aside even the whole democracy dies in darkness nonsense and all that.
But isn't it different now?
Yeah, I don't see the. Plus, I guess the other thing that strikes me as kind of funny is that, again, is there any question anywhere in anyone's mind where the Washington Post stands on Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, democracy dies in darkness.
If Bezos thinks like, oh, if I don't endorse, that'll totally, keep me on Trump's good side.
Not on his good side, but just try to keep him out of the crosshairs. There are plenty. I mean, Trump has a long enemies list. And as long as, like you said, and everyone knows, it's not like he has got a lot of focus. And so as long as you're not at the top of the list, and Bezos has done some things already that kind of Donald Trump called him out for about issues with Amazon and threatening Amazon's delivery model and deals with the post office and all kinds of other things.
But keep in mind, so is Kamala Harris.
Right, but I think Jeff Bezos would rightly believe that based on, if he is taking both candidates seriously, if not literally, he would think that there's less likelihood of some sort of massive retaliation and retribution from Kamala Harris than there would be from Donald Trump.
Oh, I wouldn't think so. But regardless, what I'm saying is, if you decide to if you're concerned about if you own a lot of other companies, right? Like, online sales companies and rocket companies and all this, and you decide, listen, I don't want the government messing with my companies because that's a concern of mine. I just like to keep a low profile. Then you don't go and buy the Washington Post,
But that was in a different
really
era.
into that.
That was in a pre-Trump
what I'm saying
era.
is Bezos knows what he got himself into.
I don't think he does. No, I mean, I think it was pretty much practically a lark almost of a thing, because Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post is more or less the equivalent of you or I buying a big screen TV. That's about the amount of a hit that he takes. So it's like, let's
Citizen Kane. I think it would be fun to run a newspaper.
Exactly, sort of thing, And so that was an era in which I think we didn't have both sides really being, I feel like, very much more willing to consider restrictions on freedom of speech, whether you call it misinformation on the left or whether you call it wokeness on the right. I feel like in 2024, freedom of speech from both and free expression on from both the left and the right is under the sort of attack that we haven't seen in a long time in this country.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that.
And so I
guess I'm not necessarily seeing it as of all the people who I think would be not particularly amenable to be threatened with that would be the guy who owns a newspaper, who owns sort of the paper of record, politically.
Well, it'd still be the New York Times, but I mean, because the Washington Post is still, it's the, if you want to talk about the failing, the Washington Post has a much smaller circulation than the New York Times. I mean,
yes, but consider where it circulates.
Yeah, but it's not like there are a bunch of power brokers in D.C. who don't read the New York Times.
I understand. They read the Times as well.
Exactly. So, I mean,
there is a Washington Post mystique that the New York Times does not have.
Yeah, I think you've watched All the President's Men too many times or something.
That's exactly what I'm thinking of. Yeah,
I get it. I get it. You're living in the past, and it's a nice place to live. But welcome to the future, Jay. So, I guess in the end, I like I said, I don't think.
Well, let me throw this at you. Sort of the counter question.
Yeah,
is what are we to make of the Democrats canceling subscriptions en masse from the Washington Post because it's not endorsing their candidate, which it knows they were going to endorse anyway. I mean, I guess that's to me that's sort of like
I think the same thing. The same thing that we make of people who decided to shoot up Bud Light cans with their hunting rifles because they sent out some sort of special can to a trans person. That it's just kind of people virtue signaling, whether it's conservative or liberal.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's what I make of it. I don't know. I mean, it certainly doesn't help. It's not like it is that much of a destructive thing to Jeff Bezos, right? I mean, the Washington Post.
No, that's what I mean. It's sort of.
Yeah, I mean, the Washington Post last year lost something like $77 million. And honestly, Jeff Bezos could lose double that easily every single year for the next 100 years, and he'd be perfectly fine. Wouldn't even feel it.
Which takes me back to my point on the.
And my point, it's not about the paper. It's about Donald Trump going after things that aren't worth just a paltry 100, 200, 300 million dollars, but things that are worth 5, 10, 15 billion dollars, and then maybe those sort of things. So in the end, and maybe I caught this wrong, but I want to be clear on this. Do you feel like in the end that Kamala Harris is less truthful and more vengeful than Donald Trump?
Well, I guess the less vengeful remains to be seen, right?
But I mean, obviously, when you're making a choice for president, you have to go on what you know, and so yes, you have less information about her. But where are you at with this? Because I'm really curious about this, sincerely.
That she is less truthful, less.
You believe that
I think she's very much untruthful.
But do you think she's less truthful and more vengeful?
Whether she is more or less vengeful, I can only look at the track records of Democrats when they get in office versus Republicans when they get in office. And, again, my concern is
I'm not trying to trick you here. I honestly want to understand your thinking on this. And if it sounds to me like you were
my thinking on, I guess I'm not sure exactly what the question is. Do I think
the question
Kamala
is,
Harris
I'll
represents
rephrase
a
it.
bigger risk for vengefulness than Trump?
Yes, that's part two of the question, and you can go with that part. Do you think that Kamala Harris would be more of a politically vengeful person if she becomes president than Donald Trump would be?
I don't know.
Okay, so it's close.
But what I can tell you is, if she chose to be, her vengeance would be more effective because it would be not resisted to the extent that Donald Trump would. She would be not as constrained by other institutional speed bumps as he would be.
Gotcha. Well, let me explore that a little more. Is that basically sort of a variant of the deep state argument?
I don't know. Maybe it's a variant of it.
Like,
it's an argument that most institutions, save a couple, are sympathetic to the Kamala Harris Democratic worldview, and that she would not have the same sort of pushback from those institutions as Donald Trump would.
Although, let me just
for example, big tech, universities, large philanthropic organizations,
but they're not institutions of government.
Unions, local prosecutors, Democrat prosecutors in big cities.
Those are segments of society, but not institutions of government. If we look at institutions of government,
they're institutions. I mean,
no, they're not. By definition, they're not institutions.
Right?
You said institutions of government. They are institutions, but they're not institutions of government. And so, if we're talking about institutional safeguards, and one thing we know,
but if you want to talk, but if you do want to talk about institutions in government, I would say, well, look at the FBI. I'll look at the Carter Page thing. Look at Strzok and Lisa, and I forget her last name.
It's coming.
The FBI. The campaign went to the Hillary Clinton campaign went to the FBI and said, we think you need to look into this. You need to get a secret wiretap from a secret court to tap Carter Page's phone. And why do we think that? Well, because here's this article from BuzzFeed that we planted telling them that you needed to do that. And here's an email from the FBI that's doctored, that was faked, that was made up. That the actual email was that he is actually an asset working for us, and they changed it to is not. And that's what I'm saying is, let's look at the track record.
Not a fair comparison.
So I think, yes, that there would be the vengefulness there.
Okay.
From Democrats, and there are government institutions that will go along with that, like the FBI did.
Although Kamala Harris, if she is elected, she will be the first president actually in, I think, 36 years who won't have unified control of government. And so Congress will be an institution that won't be going along with her. And Congress is a pretty important
I would say
institution.
that's one of the few institutions that is not, would be the House of Representatives.
And the Supreme Court will be
state legislatures.
Yeah, the Supreme Court is obviously has a strong, clear conservative majority. And certainly there are plenty of federal judges that Donald Trump has appointed. Now, the D.C. Circuit is still majority Democrat, but I don't know. It just seems, and I understand your argument.
But again, if you look to how have those institutions functioned under a Trump presidency and with Trump interests and so forth, again, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled for Donald Trump and all these various things, because they didn't.
No, yeah.
In fact, they came out against him quite vociferously a number of times on the election fraud stuff and on other things. And you could say, the Trump immunity decision. Well, that's also, I think, if you read it, it's pretty cabined into where that immunity is and how far it goes. So
got it. Yeah,
that's my point. Is I think even those institutions that you would say tend to be more conservative would still be Trump resistant.
Right. Well, I certainly hope you're right about all that, because, like I said, my prediction was an optimistic one for Harris winning. I get a sense, my gut tells me, my gut agrees with what Nate Silver said his gut was saying a week or so ago, and that's that Donald Trump will eke out, or maybe even more than eke out, a victory. And so I hope 2 years from now, if you are right about your prediction, presidential prediction, which I'm hoping you're not, obviously, we will not be in this position, and I'll say, see, I told you so.
I'll visit you in the camp.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all joking aside, I think that if Donald Trump is elected and we're back here 2 years from now, it will be just a democracy will not end, but I think it will be an absolute train wreck, a horrifically awful making his, like I said, I think it'll be just the first Trump administration, but turbocharged. And you'll be back here.
Well, I mean, maybe this is an unfair question to ask because we didn't really plan for this.
Oh, that's fine.
What would you mean by that? And what do you think by that? Or maybe we can kick this down the road for another show. But
well, I think, yeah, and I think we certainly will.
What is it that concerns you about it? I mean, I can tell you what concerns me about a Donald Trump administration, but
well, I mean, I guess the things that most concern me are a tax economic policy that looks like it's going to just skyrocket deficits and hurt the most. I mean, it is in effect, Harris was right. It is in effect going to be a national sales tax, and it's going to be a regressive tax that's going to hurt the worst off Americans the most. And I think he will put in place most of those tariffs. I'm deeply concerned that Ukraine is going to lose its support, and that's going to send a message.
I would agree with you on that one. I'm definitely with you on that one.
And I am deeply concerned about the many negative effects of mass deportation efforts, 1 million a year or more. I think that's a horrific policy for a lot of reasons. I'm very concerned about what. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Never mind. Because that would be a question for another day.
Okay.
Because that would be too. My question to that would be, well, what's the alternative if that is, that's not necessarily just Trump's policy, but let's say that's, U.S. code that says that if you come here, you seek asylum, you don't get asylum, then you shouldn't be here, and then you get deported.
Yeah, and like you said, that's a whole other conversation that we could get into. We may. Well, I'm sure we'll get into it if Donald Trump is reelected, because that will be a big thing, obviously. But I guess
unless he pulls our license.
Yeah, exactly. And then, well, I'm sure you'll be able to, hook us up there on that. But and then I've never been in the Donald Trump will end democracy camp, but I do believe that Donald Trump has no qualms about trying to pull whatever levers he can. I disagree with you. I think he's going to be far more vengeful than Kamala Harris. And I think that there will be far less institutional opposition to him, because we're seeing, I feel like that what the Bulwark and a number of organizations have suggested is that this is a sign of what's been called anticipatory obedience. This idea that if there's an aspiring authoritarian, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just get out of his way, let him do what he wants, hope he just doesn't go after you, it goes after someone else. I think there's going to be a lot more of that than you realize. I think that while in the end, there will be enough institutional guardrails that will stand up to prevent democracy dying or an existential threat. I never believe that. I think that it's going to be significantly weakened. And that's what I think if Donald Trump is reelected or is elected again, we'll be back here in a couple of years. And that's exactly the conversation we'll be saying. And I'll say, I hate to say I told you so, Jay, but I told you so. And I hope I'm wrong, All right. I'm wrong. So there's so much we didn't get to, Jay. I kind of figured this would take up our time, but I really want to talk about the fact that it's been a long time since I've had a presidential candidate I could be excited about. And I assume the same thing is true for you.
Yes. Yeah.
And why that is, and why we haven't seen, given the fact that so many Americans hate the choices they're being given, why we haven't seen like a Ross Perot type figure come up, and a number of other things along those lines. But that will have to wait to the...
Okay. Well, probably because of how it worked out for Ross Perot.
well, yeah. Well, like I said, we'll get into that, but that'll have to wait for the midweek episode, which comes out on Tuesday, Election Day. So yeah, with that, we will end. But I just want to say that if you have any thoughts about what Jay and I said, you agree, disagree, want to rant, rave, what have you, we want to hear. Well, maybe not like a crazy rant, but semi-crazy rant's fine. Anyway, there are a lot of ways to do that. mail@politicsguys.com if you're old school and like email. There's Facebook, there's X. We always have links in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forum. That's always very active. There's a lot going on. I enjoy it a lot. And if you are a supporter, you get that the Discord is one of the things you get for being a supporter. But if you're not a supporter and you want to get that full midweek episode, just let me know. Send me an email, mike@politicseyes.com, and I will get that set up for you. And you can also support us on, PayPal, Venmo. There's all kinds of ways. We'll take money however you want. The plain,
bags of cash.
Yeah, bags of cash, perfectly fine. We're willing to work with you on any of that. We always put links to that in the show notes. At our Cayman's account that will be there at some point. I don't know, but anyway, thank you so much. It really does help. And something that helps out a lot that costs nothing, only takes a few seconds, is liking us, rating and reviewing us on whatever podcast app you're listening on. That really does help, and we really would appreciate it. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our executive producers. They're a wonderful bunch: Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. And I should say before we go, next week's episode is going to be a special episode. We're going to be doing it. We think we'll be recording it Friday afternoon. We're going to try to get as many of the hosts on as we can. We're hoping at that point we should know maybe
tag team cage match. Yeah,
it's going to be something. But we're hoping that at that point we should at least maybe know the likely winner of the presidential election. The House is probably going to be in doubt, but I'm betting at that point we'll probably know the presidency and the Senate. And so we're going to try to make it an all hands on deck thing, and we hope you can join us for it.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,